I'm Jeff Sikkenga, Executive Director of the Ashbrook Center, and this is The American Idea, where we discuss the ideas, people, and events that have made America what it is today. We believe that by understanding our history and our principles, we can better live up to the promise of the American founding and preserve our ongoing experiment in self-government. Welcome to The American Idea. Well, I want to welcome everyone to this episode of The American Idea. Today, we're going to be talking about a topic that has been an issue really in many ways since the founding of the Republic, but has become increasingly important in the modern age as presidents have increased in their importance. And the office of the presidency, who holds it, what powers they exercise, and the influence they have on our lives. For that conversation, I'm joined today by Professor Jordan Cash. Jordan is assistant professor at Michigan State University at the very fine James Madison College, which is an oasis of excellence in the academic world. He is teaching, of course, teaches at Michigan State courses on the American presidency, on the U.S. Constitution, and American politics. He also is an author of a couple of really terrific books that I want to recommend to our listeners. One is will be the subject mostly of our conversation today, called The Isolated Presidency, out by Oxford University Press. And a new one, Jordan told me, is just coming out right now. Delighted to know it's called Adding the Lone Star. And I think it's on Texas entering the American Union. And that's from Kansas University Press. Two terrific books, The Isolated Presidency and Adding the Lone Star, by our guest today, Jordan Cash. Jordan, welcome to The American Idea.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right, the isolated presidency. I think when our listeners think about the presidency, the last adjective they think of is isolated. The president's always out there talking to people on TV, on the internet, at press conferences, going to emergency events that happen, campaigning. The last thing the president seems is isolated. What do you mean by that title?
Well, by that title, I mean that in this book, I look at presidents who were isolated from the normal supports we would look at for a president to be successful. So normally when we think of a successful president, we think that they're very popular, they have congressional support, usually a unified government with their party controlling Congress, and a lot of party support. They're recognized as a party leader. But I wanted to look at cases where we had presidents who lacked all those supports, that lacked popular support, lacked legislative support, lacked party support, or at least were opposed by major factions within their political parties, to see, well, what's left when we strip all the extra political supports away, and the president is only able to rely on his constitutional authority. What does that allow him to do? Can presidents still be successful based only on their constitutional authority? And so when looking at these cases, which we'll talk about, the three that I came up with were John Tyler, Andrew Johnson, and Gerald Ford. And in each of those cases, it turns out that even when only left with their constitutional authority, presidents can still do quite a bit.
That's an interesting idea, because I think most of us today think the president is so much the centerpiece of American politics, and even in many ways, American public life, that we don't think of the president as being on their own. John Tyler is the first example that you give in the book and that you discuss. Some of our listeners are pretty historically literate. Some, however, might not be fully familiar with John Tyler. Tell us about him.
Sure. So John Tyler, an interesting character. He is the first vice president to become president upon the death of his predecessor when William Henry Harrison dies. Tyler, who maybe your listeners might know, Tippecanoe and Tyler too. He's the second.
Okay. And what year is that?
Oh, sorry, that's 1840. The election of 1840. Harrison is the aforementioned Tippecanoe, great war hero, very popular. Tyler is just kind of an add-on, hence the "and Tyler too." In fact, probably the most comprehensive biography of Tyler is called "and Tyler too." So he's still kind of a second footnote in his own biography. But Tyler is the first vice president to become president upon the death of his predecessor. So there's an open question of, should he even really be the president? Is he only acting president? So there's a legitimacy question there. He doesn't have that kind of popular mandate of being elected president. And then soon thereafter, Tyler runs afoul of his own party. He was elected as a Whig, and the Whigs notoriously didn't like executive power. They very much wanted to contain the presidency after the strong administration of Andrew Jackson. But when they pass a couple national bank bills, Tyler vetoes them. He had long been an opponent of the National Bank, but that was a central part of the Whig economic program. And the Whigs react by kicking him out of the party. So not only is he an accidental president, he's also a president without a party, and hence becomes very quickly isolated, unpopular, without Congress to support him, and without a party either.
And he doesn't switch parties and become a Democrat.
He doesn't switch himself. He does try to appeal himself to the Democrats. But the interesting thing about Tyler is he had been a Democrat only a few years before. He had been a Democrat in the 1830s as a senator from Virginia, but he became a Whig in opposition to Andrew Jackson's strong use of executive power. And so when Tyler's kicked out of the Whigs, he tries to turn to the Democrats, and they say, "We don't trust you. We don't want to be around you either." So he's kind of stuck between both party coalitions who either don't trust him or see him as an apostate who turned his back on the Whig program.
So he truly is isolated. He's isolated from the person who came into the office with, Tippecanoe. He's isolated from the Whigs. He's isolated from the Democrats. Okay. So what is a guy like Tyler? It seems, therefore, his presidency is going to be a disaster. It seems like it's going to accomplish nothing. It's going to be nothing more than maybe an odd footnote in American history. And certainly at the time, he's going to be nothing but a subject of contempt and derision in America. Is that how the presidency of John Tyler turned out?
Not really. It's kind of interesting to see, but Tyler actually manages to be successful in some of his initiatives. So let's look at domestically. Now, it's true, Tyler doesn't really get any of his own initiatives through Congress. That's the problem with not having people like you in Congress or in your own party. But if we look at Tyler as kind of a negative force, as somebody who was opposing the Whig agenda, in that he is extremely successful. He's able to use the veto to block all these Whig bills. He blocks the National Bank. He blocks internal improvements. He blocks raising tariffs, or at the very least, he uses the veto to come to a kind of compromise over tariffs that is closer to his position than to the Whigs' position. So domestically, at least, he's able to prevent any policies he doesn't like from becoming law, even if he doesn't necessarily act as a positive force. So there's a strong, I guess, negative aspect to the presidency domestically. And we might even see an administration too. Tyler is able to, so he comes into office, and you might imagine that most of the appointees at the time were Whigs, having been appointed by his predecessor. But Tyler realizes, well, they're not going to be very helpful to me. They don't like me very much. And so he's able to use the president's removal power to purge the bureaucracy, and his appointment power to get people he likes into place. So he does construct an administration that is more in line with his constitutional, political, and policy vision. And even in foreign policy, we see that he's able to do quite a lot diplomatically. He extends diplomatic protection over Hawaii, which is an independent kingdom at that point. He opens up diplomatic relations with China. The first bilateral American-Chinese treaty, the Treaty of Wenzhou, is ratified in 1842 under Tyler's administration. And most notably, the annexation of Texas is initiated and concluded with Tyler being the driving force for it. So altogether, especially in foreign policy, it's a fairly impressive record for an isolated president.
And I think one of the things that you say in the book is that one of the things that shows is that even isolated presidents under our Constitution have a lot of authority in things like foreign affairs, being the chief diplomat, negotiating, making treaties with the advice and consent of the Senate. And so it shows you that some of the constitutional powers, you don't have to have political support in order to be able to effectively exercise those.
That's right. It really is a demonstration of how the Constitution number one, creates a strong executive, right? I think there's this idea that the traditional presidency, as it's often referred to, is this weak, very deferential office. 19th century presidents don't really do anything. It's not until the 1930s that we get this robust modern presidency. But folks like Tyler would demonstrate that that's not true, that the traditional constitutional presidency is quite powerful. It gives the president a lot of tools in his toolbox, and especially a lot of tools that he can use unilaterally by himself when necessary.
The other second president case example you give us is, of course, Andrew Johnson. Um, Famously unpopular, certainly looked back upon now with, I think, by many historians in a very negative light. He succeeds to the presidency, of course, after Abraham Lincoln, his beloved predecessor, is assassinated. How is Andrew Johnson isolated?
Yeah, in a way, Johnson is in an even tougher spot than Tyler is. So Johnson, a Southern Democrat from Tennessee, traditional Jacksonian, he runs with Lincoln in 1864 as part of the National Union Party ticket, right? Supposed to bring the country together in this team of Lincoln and Johnson. But then when Lincoln is assassinated, what's Johnson left with? He's a Southern Democrat now facing a Congress full of Northern Republicans, as well as a cabinet full of Northern Republicans. So, ideologically speaking and philosophically speaking, he's at odds with not just Congress and the coalition that raised him to the vice presidency, but even his own cabinet. So, he's lacking popular support, legislative support, and party support, but even to some degree, administrative support as well, which puts him in a very tough spot.
So, what happens to Andrew Johnson?
A lot, a lot of things.
A lot and a lot bad, right?
A lot and a lot bad. Yeah. So,
How does he run crosswise of Congress? What happens?
well, the first thing is when Lincoln is assassinated, Congress is out of session. And so Johnson, again, demonstrating the immense power, constitutional authority that the president has, in this case over the administration, Johnson goes ahead, instead of waiting for Congress to come back into session to figure out what Reconstruction is going to look like, Johnson takes it upon himself to initiate what's called presidential Reconstruction. And in general, this is a very lenient Reconstruction. It emphasizes getting the South back on its feet, establishing civilian government, getting Southern representatives back into Congress as quickly as possible. Johnson issues a series of pardons for former Confederates and Southerners. So when Congress comes back into session at the end of December 1865, they realize, well, Johnson's already done all this work. He's kind of already set the playing field, and all they can do is react to it. Johnson has exercised what political scientists call the first mover advantage, right? He's kind of set the stage, and now Congress is in a reactive position. But of course, Congress is particularly radical Republicans in Congress. They don't like this Reconstruction, so they push back against it. They pass a series of bills trying to get their own Reconstruction in. Johnson, much like Tyler, vetoes those bills, and eventually that ruins any sort of constructive relationship the two institutions might have had.
So, how bitter and poisonous is it between Johnson and the radical Republicans?
It gets pretty bad and gets bad pretty quickly. So in 1866, for example, Johnson trying to use the position of the president. So that's another interesting thing looking at this, is how the Constitution does position the president to have this popular connection with the people. And Johnson tries to capitalize on that. He goes on a speaking tour around the United States, around the northern United States, called the Swing Around the Circle. But he acts like a demagogue. It's very demagogic. He accuses his opponents, the radical Republicans, of being either just short or actual traitors themselves, that now they're the ones betraying the Union.
Wow, that's a strong charge when you've just had a civil war.
It is. And well, it gets a little bit worse when Johnson not so subtly compares himself to Jesus Christ on a couple of occasions and his persecution. So he's not exactly trying to win over the radical Republicans here. He's being very brazen. And in fact, that becomes one of the articles of impeachment against him, is his disparagement of Congress on this tour. Of course, policy-wise, he's still pushing for his own brand of Reconstruction. Congress is pushing back until finally Congress passes a series of bills that try to strongly restrict presidential authority. The most famous being, of course, the Tenure of Office Act that said the president could not remove a member of the cabinet without the Senate's approval. And that's what really gets Johnson into trouble when he tries to
And
remove.
that comes out of the the Constitution's provision that the president appoints members of his cabinet with the advice and consent of the Senate. And the radical Republicans' argument was, well, if he has to have our advice and consent in putting people into office, he has to have the same for removing them from office.
Precisely. So we have this interesting constitutional debate that really goes back to the first Congress, or even in some ways the Federalist Papers, because the Constitution doesn't say anything about who removes executive officers. It simply says how they're appointed. So presidents, really throughout all American history, going back to Washington through Johnson and beyond, said, well, no, the president should have a unilateral removal power, that's how you have the attribute of responsibility, that for the administration to be responsible to the president needs a removal power. Congress, though, some members of the first Congress, but definitely the radical Republicans said, no, the logic is if the Senate is needed to appoint, the Senate needs to be there to remove. So we have a conflict of constitutional interpretation between the president and Congress here, and Johnson is at the center of that.
So in this conflict between Andrew Johnson and the radical Republicans, where's the American public? Who do they side with?
Not with Johnson. They are not very happy with him. He tries to rally public support in 1866 with this speaking tour. It completely backfires on him. The Republicans gain more seats in the 1866 midterms. And then when Johnson tries to run for election in his own right in 1868, he runs as a Democrat. And that doesn't go well for him. He doesn't become the Democratic nominee, and he just he survives impeachment, but just barely, and ends up having to retire.
Before we continue with our conversation, I'd like to have one of our faculty members tell you about a special documents-based graduate program for teachers of American history, government, and civics.
Hi, this is John Moser, Chair of the Master of Arts in American History and Government program at Ashland University. If you are an educator who teaches U.S. history, government, or politics, our program may be just what you've been looking for. Our approach is to emphasize primary sources, since we think the best way to study the past is to read the words of those who lived it. We have a distinguished faculty made up of professors from both Ashland University and from colleges and universities across the country. And they're not there to lecture to you. We think it's better to learn through conversation about the documents. Ours is a hybrid program with two different types of seminar. The first are our week-long intensive in-person courses during the summers on the beautiful campus of Ashland University. The second are our live synchronous online seminars offered throughout the year. So if you're a social studies teacher and you're looking to deepen your understanding of America's past and its politics, please check out the Master of Arts in American History and Government program. You can do that by visiting tah.org/programs.
So what if someone posed this argument to your book and saying, look, so Andrew Johnson shows you that when you're really isolated, and then when you act as though you're not, and you try and attack your opponents rather than trying to build bridges and build goodwill, you become so isolated that you actually are ineffective as a president, and you can't really exercise even your constitutional powers, or you get impeached. What about that? How do you respond to that argument?
Well, to the last point on impeachment, I would say that is kind of the ultimate check on the president, is impeachment. So if Congress really thought Johnson was doing illegal and unconstitutional things, that was a reasonable thing to do. But to the argument about Johnson's effectiveness, yes, he is not very popular. Yes, Congress really goes after him. But if you delve down into his policies for Reconstruction in particular, he's actually fairly successful. Yes, Congress tries to push back, but Johnson is able to use, whenever Congress goes out of recess, his administrative authority, and the way that the presidency is in continual operation. He can exploit those recesses of Congress to impose his own policies in Reconstruction. Really, we can see that the seeds that then become later Jim Crow, later segregation, are planted by Johnson, creating this very lenient policy for the South and a Reconstruction that isn't punitive towards it, but allows the Southern elite to kind of get back on their feet much quicker. So in a way, Johnson appears to be a loser in 1868, but looking back long term, he's actually quite successful.
Interesting, because then your book takes us to the third example, right, which is almost 100 years later, a little more than 100 years later. We go from the 1860s to the 1970s, and Gerald Ford, who famously described himself as a Ford, not a Lincoln.
Yes.
To say, look, he's not a dazzling politician. He's not a great orator like a Ronald Reagan. He's no FDR. He comes into office. I think we look back at Gerald Ford now, and I say this as a person from Michigan, from near his district in Grand Rapids. Lots of people in that area love Gerald Ford, have very fond memories of Gerald Ford. They don't think of him as an isolated president. They think of him as beloved, genial fellow who lots of people liked. How was Gerald Ford an isolated president?
Yeah, that's a good question. I agree. Compared to the other two, Ford is probably the most likable of the three. But he also has a very interesting constitutional position because unlike Tyler and unlike Johnson, Ford isn't even elected vice president, right? So he's actually the first person appointed to the vice presidency under the terms of the 25th Amendment by Richard Nixon, then confirmed by Congress. And then when Nixon resigns, he becomes president. So he's unique among all presidents in not having been elected by the American people at any stage, whether the vice presidency or the presidency. So he is very popular in his district, it's true, but that was never quite reflected on a national level. But in addition to that, of course, he hasn't faced a popular electorate, so that's the popular piece. The Democrats have a strong hold on Congress, which only gets worse in the 1974 midterms when you have these large majorities of Democrats. I believe a veto-proof majority in the House and a pretty strong majority in the Senate. So of the Watergate babies who are very committed to restricting presidential power. And then on the Republican side, Ford, he was the House Minority Leader for the Republicans for a long time. So you'd think he would have this leadership over the party, but there's discontentment among conservative Republicans with the Nixon administration that carries over into the Ford and then is embodied really in the 1976 challenge to Ford by Ronald Reagan. So the Republican Party splinters under Ford's feet as he's president.
There's a new book, I'm sure you know, out by Richard Norton Smith on Gerald Ford, right?
Yes.
An Ordinary Man. Interesting. And it talks about the historic presidency of Ford. And again, I think our listeners will be surprised by the argument of your book, which is people think Ford was just appointed, this sort of bumbling character who stumbled into the White House. And then he's only there a couple of years. He runs, he gets challenged by his own party. Then he runs in the general election in 1976 and loses to the Democrat Jimmy Carter. So Gerald Ford, again, is a weird historical asterisk whose presidency really doesn't matter for the country. You argue that's not true.
I do. Again, like with Tyler, like with Johnson, I think we see that Ford, again, stripped of all these other political supports, right? So he doesn't have the support we would expect of an FDR or a Reagan, or even some of his contemporaries like Nixon, who had won these great electoral college victories. But Ford is still able to get things done. He's still able to achieve some of his policy goals. Maybe not all of them, maybe not the great dazzling legislative victories of a Lyndon Johnson, but he's able to do quite a bit. So one thing that I think is very interesting about Ford is the way he uses his veto, for example. And this may come from his experience in Congress, but he's able to engage Congress in a way that forces them to compromise. And he uses the veto not like Tyler and Johnson did. So Tyler and Johnson tended to use the veto as kind of a clear stop, right? To just say, we're not going to allow this, and that's the end of it. Ford would use the veto and his veto messages, because we have to remember the Constitution says that the president must deliver a message back to Congress explaining why he's vetoed this legislation. And Ford would use those messages not only to make constitutional arguments about legislation, but then to say how it could be improved, what he might be willing to sign, to engage Congress in a deliberative conversation to construct legislation. And so the result is you did have a series of bills passed that Ford maybe wasn't 100% happy with, and Congress wasn't really happy with, but it was a compromise that might not have been able to happen otherwise, except for Ford's strategic use of his veto pen.
So a president like Ford, who starts out isolated, and of course, I think in your book, and of course, as we know from the public record and the history, also uses his pardon power in a very controversial way. What's that, and how does that affect his isolation?
Yes, so that's a very good question. We see with all three of these presidents that none of them had to be isolated. They all made decisions and used their powers in such a way that really created, well, there were conditions for isolation, but then they kind of isolate themselves with how they use their power. And I think that's clearest with Ford, because you're right, Nixon resigns, Ford comes in, and initially Ford is very popular. But upon reflecting on Nixon's position, on what the country needed, for about a month, Ford then issues what's probably the most famous pardon in American history, pardoning Richard Nixon for any crimes that might have occurred during his administration. And this absolutely ruins Ford's popularity. His approval rating drops, I think, 20 points overnight. It contributes to the Democrats having an overwhelming victory in the 1974 midterms. So it makes an already precarious position even worse for Ford. But it is, again, demonstrative of the unilateral possibilities of the presidency that Ford, well, and it also shows his kind of constitutional vision of what he thought the country needed, because he believed that the country needed to move on after Watergate. So he's using his long-term perspective and the national perspective that the Constitution gives the presidency to say what's best for the country, and it's to move past Watergate. But also he considers Nixon's civil rights or constitutional rights, that he doesn't think Nixon could get a fair trial. Everyone's too passionate about Watergate, about what's going to happen. So it's in the best interest of the country, in the best interest of the protection of the rights of this man, Richard Nixon, to make the pardon. And of course, Congress can't do anything about it. They rant and rave about it, but the pardon is in some ways the most imperial of the president's powers. It can't be overturned like a veto can. Once it's done, it's done. Congress, the courts, they can't do anything about it.
So when you have a vast power like that, the power of pardon, take Ford's case. Did he have to be persuaded by someone against his own judgment or against his own inclination? Like, yeah, I guess I better pardon Richard Nixon. Or was it Ford's idea to pardon Nixon?
It doesn't seem that Ford needed to be persuaded, but he did have to deliberate on it with his advisors, which I think is an important thing that we need to think about, is that the president does, as much as we talk about he's isolated, he does have advisors, but ultimately it's the president who's making that final decision. It shows that there is kind of this deliberative element to the presidency in that he can consult these advisors, consult his cabinet, for example. But it doesn't seem that Ford needed to be necessarily persuaded to do it. It wasn't necessarily against his will or that he had some other goal in mind and then had to be talked into it. But he did want to explore all these different avenues before he decided on it. And it came at really personal cost to his own staff. His press secretary, for example, who was a lifelong friend of Ford, resigned over this pardon. So when we talk about how unpopular it was, many people in the administration
Even
too.
within his own administration, it's popular. Because
Yeah.
it got me thinking when you were talking about that, you think of Tyler, Johnson, and Ford and being isolated. I think some of our listeners, and certainly I'm thinking about this, boy, what kind of character do you have to be able to endure that? Take Ford's example. He thinks really the pardon of Nixon is for the best long-term interest of the country. It's his own unilateral power that's unchecked by Congress, but he knows he's going to get political heat for it. There's going to be outrage. People in his own administration are going to quit. Lifelong friends will despise him. Can you just talk a little bit about what you learned about the character of isolated presidents like Ford that allow them to continue in the job and even try and run for election in 1976, despite this lonely, isolated, difficult position that someone like Ford faced?
Yeah, I think it goes to the fact that you really need a president who is willing to make those tough decisions, who is willing to bear the burden of being unpopular, of having all these attacks against them. And Ford, I think, is a unique character, even among the isolated presidents, and I would argue among all of American presidents. When it comes to presidents with a lot of character, with great character, I think Ford is up there with the best of them. And I think the Nixon pardon demonstrates that clear-eyed vision of doing what's right, even when it's not popular. And if I could kind of spin that around, we might also look at Johnson as a kind of antithesis case. So within the isolated presidents, we almost have these two case studies of why character is important in the presidency, that Ford demonstrates a president who's willing to take a hit by doing something that's necessary. Johnson, in how he treats Reconstruction and the way he articulates, especially his opposition to expanding civil rights for African Americans, and he makes the argument that, well, states' rights need to overcome, are more important than the individual rights of African Americans. There, you have a man in Johnson who is willing to stand up to being unpopular and doing what he thinks is best, but we rightly can judge his decisions to be bad ones, right? That he made bad calls, he made bad decisions that had long-standing negative consequences for the country. Like I said earlier, his Reconstruction policies sow the seeds for Jim Crow, sow the seeds for a lot of the racial issues we're still dealing with today. So having a good character who can make these good judgment calls is very important. I think we can see Ford and Johnson as a good example and a bad example.
Right. So it's not just the courage to make a tough decision, but the wisdom to make the right tough decision.
Precisely. Yes, that's
yeah. Let me ask you this. You've had a chance. We have the hindsight of history now, which is, of course, one of the reasons why we have the American Idea podcast. We want to learn and get some insight from what history shows us. Has history now, and you are one of the people engaged in this, has history been kinder to the isolated presidents over time? Or is the judgment of historians on Tyler, Johnson, and Ford the same as it was of their contemporaries?
Yeah, I think history has been the kindest to Ford. I think it's recognized his wisdom in making those good judgment calls, even at the expense of his own popularity and political prospects. Tyler and Johnson is kind of interesting because he kind of had a little bit of a bump. I think you had lost cause historians say from the South saying he made the right call, and it was really the Northerners who went against him and tarnished his reputation, all these things. But I think Johnson's reputation now is pretty low for some of the reasons we've talked about. Tyler, too, tends to be rated, at least in rankings of presidents, historically low. If we look at just his accomplishments, I think he's probably lower than he should be. But I was reminded by a friend recently that I might be a minority of one on that point.
Well, maybe this book will begin to change people's minds. For our listeners, again, the book is The Isolated Presidency from Oxford University Press by Professor Jordan Cash. This has been a fascinating conversation. I think we now have, we've whetted our appetite for this book and for your next book coming out, Adding the Lone Star from Kansas University Press. Professor Jordan Cash, thanks for taking the time to join us on The American Idea.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to this episode of The American Idea. If you enjoyed this episode, remember to subscribe at Apple Podcast, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts, and leave a 5-star review. If you want to learn more or get involved in Ashbrook's vital work, visit our website, ashbrook.org.